So I have been, for the last few years, I'm constantly being forced to put this climate and, care dimension or social dimension in general together. It's very difficult. So I'm a feminist economist, which already means that I need to discuss many, many matters. Like a feminist economist ends up being someone that, like, I teach microeconomics, but everyone sees me as a macroeconomist for some reason. I'm writing mostly on policy, applied work in Brazil. And one of the main obstacles we have today is that people are trying to think of this just transition. In policy terms, it really means trying to think of how we can come up with solutions for the climate crisis that are not increasing inequality, and of course that still brings about growth. We never give up on that. So the problem is that more frequently than we would like, there are contradictory goals between feminism, economics, and sustainable development, especially if you're not evaluating a national policy for the US or an European country. So I want to focus today on economic policy responses to those crises, comparing a little bit these possibilities, the possibility of solutions for countries like the US or European countries, to the case of Brazil, where I do most work on the hope that the case of Brazil does shed some light also on other countries, even though Brazil is quite privileged in some terms when it comes to global south countries. And I think this has been a little mentioned already in other sessions. So I'll start by very briefly talking about how I see the care and the climate crisis, but mostly my view align a lot with that of Srisha and Deborah, so that already helps me a little bit. But just to recapture, I see care crisis and climate crisis as both intrinsic to capitalism. The process of accumulation itself creates an incentive to expropriate people of their labor, like in the case of unpaid reproductive work, and to expropriate nature. So this is the consequence of reproductive and nature spheres not being considered in the productive sphere, as Srisha already mentioned. And one expression of that, which I think is important when we're talking about policy, is the fact that neither impacts to natural resources nor unpaid care work are accounted for in GDP. So our macroeconomic policies tend to disregard and intensify those. So in macroeconomic modeling terms, this means that you are really trying to solve a three-dimensional problem, where those dimensions are treated as separate ones. So we are trying to come up with policies that are combating inequalities and show that they deliver growth without increasing carbon emissions. This is one basic setup. We're not trying to, so for example, one of the traits of being a feminist economist that I like to explain is that I am not a gender economist in the sense that I'm not here trying to show that gender equality will bring about growth. My end goal is gender equality, and this is very different. So as a consequence, we have very few economists today even trying to attempt to work on climate and care at the same time. We do have some environmental economists that will mostly analyze how certain green policies can bring about growth and then go for those or argue for those, and gender economists or feminist economists showing how, and then I'm going to give you one very specific example, invest in care can create jobs and benefit the economy as a whole. Even assuming that there are few solutions within our system to the care crisis or solutions to the climate crisis that still bring about growth, not accounting for the two of them at the same time will be a problem. And one reason is because the care and climate dimensions reinforce each other, and I think also Srisha already did a very good job with that. But again, to cite a few, the climate change will impact access to resources such as water, food, will increase illness, damage physical and social care infrastructure. Climate disasters have been impacting mostly vulnerable communities already extremely burdened by care responsibilities, so climate crisis is increasing care crisis. And at the same time, we have the fact that climate resilient practices require intensive labor, and I think that Srisha did much better than me, like really thinking of those as the same. I'm not even separating care and climate, but organic agriculture, recycling, composting, to cite a few more common to the US context. So the care crisis affect also women's ability to care for nature, and we see a decrease in reforestation, land rehabilitation, waste management practices, and so on. So when you don't think of those two dimensions together, and when making policy recommendations, we're really not being that rigorous. And things are going to get even more complicated if we acknowledge that most people are only considering the impacts of their policies within their countries. And both of those crises are global. There are innumerous contradictions between, for example, growth in the US and racial equality in the global South. So even the most progressive economists keep trying to run models, hoping that the results will be that increasing gender or racial equality will bring about sustainable growth. But what if it doesn't? What if gender equality does bring growth to the global North, but only at the cost of even more inequality in the global South? Or what if the best strategy for the global North to build greener and gender-equal national economies is to renew colonial relations? So I have been begging to those running models for their developed countries not to exclude from their analysis the impacts that certain policies will have on women across the world. That's not appropriate work in the traditions of political economy. To be a feminist political economist is to bring to light such intrinsic contradictions of the economics discipline and draw conclusions from that. Any Latin American macroeconomists need to understand how the rest of the world interact with their economies. It is an European and a US privilege to ignore the rest of the world. You can't count carbons within the borders, and you can't count carbons without considering their social impact around the globe. So let's talk a little bit about policy recommendations to climate and care. And I'll start with care. The standard solution given to care has been to invest in care infrastructure, so basically shift to the state part of the care responsibilities. It is a very sound solution accepted by feminists and world bankers alike. When you invest in care infrastructure, you relieve the care burden, you create jobs in a highly feminized sector, which means that you are increasing the demand for female labor, which also increases women's income. And on top of that, care sectors are labor intensive and have very high multiplier effects, especially when compared to physical infrastructure sectors. So this is a classical example of a gender-sensitive policy that also delivers growth. So we know very well already how to sell those policies to finance ministers. It's not that hard, and you do not need to talk to them about social justice. You can only talk to them, you could talk to them about just the economic advantages of those policies. And this has worked well in many countries, and it might work well in European countries with no fiscal constraint. It could work in the US if there was political will. I'm not going to get on that page because that's a little more complicated. But it certainly does not work for a country like Brazil. Some people have talked about Brazil before, but I'm gonna look at it from the taxation perspective only and not go so much into the spending part of fiscal rules. I think Clara already talked a little bit about that yesterday. So look at it this way. 50% of the income in Brazil is in the hands of the top 10%. The percentage of our population making more than minimum wage is very low. High GDP per capita and lower inequality means that you have a much larger base of population that can be taxed. So one of the traits of Latin American countries has been that our tax revenue comes mostly from indirect taxes. We've been really called upon that. But it's an extremely difficult figure to change. We can't really increase who we're taxing. Politically speaking, increasing taxes at the top is super difficult. This is what we've been pushing for. But this means that there is also a constraint on our capacity of getting more tax revenues. Add that to the fact that we have austerity and people are cutting spending and are really looking to the deficit, it becomes very difficult to push for more services to be provided. We are actually, right now, we are defending the ones we already have. So the other thing I want to mention is that so take the case of the US or an European country, the high GDP per capita and low inequality, I mean, more in Europe so than in the US, but still compared to Brazil, US is not that unequal. That is determinant for these countries to be able to raise enough revenues to sustain a welfare state. And that cannot be dissociated from the inequality and poverty in other countries. Continuous colonialist relationships cannot be disregarded here. So this doesn't only mean that a country like Brazil cannot have an European welfare state. It means that the European welfare state comes at the cost of exploitation of African and Latin American countries. Around the globe, the care crisis is being solved for some women at the cost of many. The state solution is one of those cases. But also in Brazil, what we have is that nearly 1/5 of employed black women are domestic workers. They represent 61% of individuals and 67% of the women employed in that sector. They are paid less than minimum wage. They have a 75% informality rate, which is twice the average in the country. And only 30% of them have pension plans, which means that when they retire, well, they're not retired, so they will take care of people their whole lives and they will not be cared for when they age. And so basically in Brazil, what happened is that we have an army of informal precarized workers providing an essential service for other people, and mostly women, to participate in the labor market. Racism and sexism have been the solutions to the care crisis in Brazil. I don't know how I'm doing with time. So one example, sorry? Okay, yeah, so one example of this is in 2016, there was passed a law that finally made domestic workers workers in Brazil. So up to 2016, domestic workers were not allowed to be seen as workers. They could not be formal workers. We have labor laws that apply to workers in general. They could not apply to them. Our labor laws date from 1943. They only became seen as workers in 2016. There was a huge backlash from middle class and white women around the country on this issue. So what happens is the fact that we are counting on racism to solve our care crisis, this is a way of dividing women between black and white women. So it's really hard to have a feminist movement that is coherent if racism is on the basis of solving this crisis. And you can see the same for citizens and migrant women in the US, and in general, privileged women and vulnerable women all around the world. So there has also been a tendency for us to ignore the care crisis as racial capitalism has given a solution to it, and focus on the climate crisis, which has created a great opportunity for capitalism to reinvent itself and renew those colonial relations. So we're just entering a new phase of the same old racialized capitalism in the way that policies for the climate have been put together for now. So turning to those common climate crisis solutions that are being given on the global north, mostly they are addressing climate crisis as an energy crisis. So US and European countries are very focused on mitigation and coming up with some unsatisfying solutions such as renewable energies, electric cars, and so on. Meanwhile, for example, in the case of Brazil, and the food consumption that around the world that is kind of incentivizes deforestation in many countries is one of the many reasons why Brazil has a lot of deforestation. And 67% of emissions in Brazil come from deforestation. We do not have an energy crisis. So our mitigation efforts cannot go onto energy. Our mitigation efforts needs to go towards deforestation. And also it will not be solved by solutions such as electric cars. Electric cars are, though, a great solution for profit accumulation. They renew extractivist relations between central and peripheral economies. So taking from the perspective of a country like Brazil, mitigation efforts need to focus on stopping deforestation, and we need to already understand that we are being affected by the climate crisis. One example is the case of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, who was flooded last year. So we really need to start shifting focus from mitigation policies to adaptation policies and put in place emergency reserves. On the fiscal context we have, that is shaped by austerity, this poses even more obstacles. So I'm running out of time, I guess. I just want to end by speaking up to what I think a center like CHE can do when it's doing its research, because I think this was a question also by Clara on the very first panel. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I would like Globe Norfolk scholars to be extremely aware of the impact that their scholarship has on Global South. I don't think you know that. So we live in the age of evidence-based public policy. I think last panel already did a great job on creating problems to that idea. So we need to be responsible for how we produce what is regarded as this evidence. One example of this that has not to do with the methodologies we use is that an empirical paper using US data or OECD data is a case study. It's not a general case, and it is published everywhere as if, like the titles of it, it's sold as if when you have your US data, you're actually talking about how to solve a problem for the world. It's not like that. It is obvious, but you have no idea how much energy, for example, we need to put in Brazil to try to deconstruct this feeling that what we need is electric cars. This is one example of it. And finally, what we need from Global North scholars is not just to echo our work, but actually to dispute the policies being made in the Global North, accounting for the effect it will have on us. So for example, when the US overreacts to inflation by increasing their interest rate, you're not only increasing inequality in the US, you are impacting other countries' inflation. Or, as already mentioned, you incentivizing the production and consumption of electric cars means more assertivism in Latin America. You can come up with that research. You don't need Global South scholars to be doing that research. That is feasible here as well. Finally, all of us have privilege in some way from this current system, and that includes absolutely everyone here, even if many more, much more than others. And we need to acknowledge that. So a heterodox economist cannot avoid complex themes, and we cannot be afraid to point out those contradictions, not even personal contradictions, even if that makes us uncomfortable and incoherent sometimes. It is by resolving those contradictions that we'll reach change, and I think Sirisha ended kind of on the same note, which I really like. So if our research does not take as a departure point the fact that we are profiting from racialized colonial relations, it will only come up with solutions to our current crisis that are either useless, or in the best case scenario, or that will reinforce those racialized colonial relations. Thank you.